The stench of civilization. Imagine walking through a medieval street in Paris. The air is thick, not with perfume, but with rot. Chamber pots fly out of windows, pigs wander freely, and the sweet smell of freshly baked bread mixes with human waste. People rarely bathed. Water itself was feared, believed to carry disease, demons, even sin. Soap? A luxury for the rich. And perfume? The medieval answer to deodorant. This was a world where cleanliness wasn't next to godliness. It was often seen as suspicious. A world where doctors warned that washing too much could make your body weak, and where royalty and peasants alike carried oranges stuffed with cloves to fight off the unbearable odor of everyday life. Welcome to the real story of medieval hygiene, a tale so absurd, so foul, and so fascinating that it could only be true. Bathing was dangerous, or so they believed. To modern minds, a bath is comfort. In medieval Europe, it was a risk. Public bathhouses had existed since Roman times, but by the early Middle Ages, they were fading fast. The church warned that shared bathing led to temptation and, worse, disease. Monks wrote that hot water opened the pores to sin. In London, public baths known as stews dotted the banks of the Thames. At first, they were respectable places, warm rooms scented with herbs, filled with chatter and steam. But as moral panic spread, stews became synonymous with brothels. In 1546, King Henry VIII finally banned them altogether, blaming them for spreading syphilis. For ordinary people, washing meant little more than wiping hands before meals or splashing the face on feast days. Bathing one's whole body was reserved for medical emergencies or spiritual purification. Still, some households, especially in France and Italy, clung to older traditions. Records show that Eleanor of Aquitaine kept a personal wooden tub lined with linen sheets, scented with rose petals and rosemary. But peasants? They bathed maybe a few times a year, often in the river, and always clothed. The irony was bitter. The less they washed, the more they feared disease, yet they blamed water itself for sickness. Miasma, or bad air, was the invisible enemy. And what could be more dangerous than breathing in the steam of another man's bath? Toilets, pits, and the flying chamber pot. If medieval people didn't bathe, you can guess how bad their toilets were. Cities like London and Paris overflowed with waste. Privies, simple wooden boxes with a hole, sat above open pits called cesspools. These were emptied by gong farmers, the unsung heroes or victims of hygiene. They worked at night, climbing into pits with shovels and buckets to scoop out tons of filth. They were paid well, but lived short, miserable lives. In castles, garderobes were built into stone walls, with a chute dropping straight into the moat. The smell was so strong that nobles hung their clothes there, believing the stench would drive away moths. For city dwellers, chamber pots were the norm. Each morning, housewives tossed the contents into the street, often shouting a warning in French, "Garde à l'eau," which literally means watch out for the water. Few did. By the 1300s, streets were so foul that city ordinances tried to control it. Paris demanded every house have a pit privy. London fined those who dumped waste on the street. But enforcement was weak, and rain washed everything, human waste, animal entrails, and market blood, straight into the Thames. This was the same river from which people drew their drinking water. The result? Typhoid, dysentery, cholera, centuries before anyone understood germs. Still, they kept blaming bad smells, not bacteria. And so, medieval Europe reeked, not of sin, but of ignorance. The perfume of survival. With filth unavoidable, scent became salvation. In royal courts, nobles wore pomanders, little metal orbs filled with cloves, amber, and musk. Ladies carried sprigs of lavender and mint inside their sleeves. Doctors prescribed vinegar of the four thieves, a mix of herbs believed to ward off the plague. Perfume wasn't just luxury, it was armor. When the Black Death hit in the 14th century, people carried flowers to purify the air. This is where the children's rhyme, "Ring a ring of roses," may have originated. Each verse a grim reminder of sickness and death, masked by fragrance. Barbers and bath attendants mixed animal fat with ashes to make crude soap. Spain and Italy, influenced by Islamic trade, introduced better quality olive oil soaps from Aleppo and Castile, centuries ahead of Northern Europe. But even those who could afford it used soap rarely. Instead, clean linen was the true sign of hygiene. White shirts and chemises absorbed sweat and oil, so changing clothes was as good as a bath. This belief lasted well into the 18th century, when Queen Elizabeth I proudly claimed to bathe once a month, whether I need it or not.
Faith, fear, and filth. Religion shaped everything. The church preached inner purity over outer cleanliness. Priests warned that obsession with the body was vanity. Monks followed strict washing rituals before prayer, but these were symbolic: hands, face, and feet. Full bathing was rare, except in monastic infirmaries. Ironically, monastic hospitals were among the cleanest places in Europe. Yet when plagues returned, the faithful turned inward. Flagellants roamed towns whipping themselves, believing sin caused disease. Doctors burned incense and prayed. Science slept under the weight of superstitions. Still, in this world of filth and faith, a strange resilience grew. People adopted. They masked stench with herbs, replaced soap with linen, replaced plumbing with prayer. And somehow, out of this chaos came progress. By the 15th century, universities in Bologna and Paris began studying public health. Cities built rudimentary sewers. Bathhouses returned, slowly, discreetly, under new names. Cleanliness, once a sin, was becoming a virtue again. From stench to civilization. When you step into a modern shower, you're touching the end of a 1,000-year journey. From the foul alleys of medieval London to the perfumed courts of Versailles, hygiene evolved, not from knowledge, but from desperation. Every plague, every stink, every superstition forced people to change. Today, we laugh at the idea that bathing was dangerous, yet our ancestors survived, endured, and built the cities we now scrub clean. The next time you open a bar of soap, remember, it's not just cleanliness, it's victory over filth, fear, and the dark centuries that nearly drowned Europe in its own waste. The water that could kill you. In medieval Europe, water was not the source of life, it was a source of fear. To understand why, you must forget everything you know about purity. Forget clear springs and running taps. Imagine instead a world where rivers carried waste and wells were graveyards in disguise. A world where every sip of water could mean your death. By the 13th century, the cities of Europe, London, Paris, Florence, Cologne, were bursting with people but starving for sanitation. Rivers became open sewers. The Thames in England, the Seine in France, both were choked with refuse, animal carcasses, human waste, and blood from butcher shops. The same water that powered the mills, that turned the wheels of industry, was the water people used to wash their faces, brew their beer, and cook their stew. The medieval man didn't trust water because he knew it made him sick. He just didn't know why. Doctors, philosophers, and priests all had their theories. The popular one was miasma, bad air that rose from rot. When the smell was foul, The air itself was believed to be poisoned. Bathing in hot water, they said, opened the pores and allowed the evil vapors to enter your body. To bathe was to invite death inside. So people turned to alternatives. Beer, ale, wine, these were safer. The brewing process boiled the liquid and killed many of the pathogens, though they didn't know that. Even children drank ale. In England, a small beer, weak and cheap, was given to peasants and toddlers alike. Monks brewed stronger ales for their own use, often safer than the well water outside their abbey walls. But what if you were poor and had no ale? You drank whatever was near: a puddle, a ditch, a stream behind the tanner's shop. And if you were unlucky, that stream carried the same runoff that tanners used: lye, ash, and animal fat. The Church's dilemma. The Church both shaped and reflected this fear of water. On one hand, baptism, the ritual washing of sin, was the cornerstone of faith. Water was holy when blessed by a priest, but everyday water, the kind that touched the body, was profane. Priests and theologians taught that too much care for cleanliness bordered on vanity. In monasteries, rules were strict. The rule of Saint Benedict allowed washing only at specific times: before Easter, before Pentecost, and before Christmas. Hands and feet could be cleaned for prayer, but full immersion, rare and often frowned upon. Yet even within the Church, contradictions festered. Some abbeys built elaborate bathhouses, stone rooms with heated floors, water piped in through clay channels. The Abbey of Cluny in France was famous for its sophisticated washing systems. There, the monks lived more like lords than paupers. But further north, in the damp chill of England and Germany, the tone was harsher. The cold made bathing miserable, and superstition made it deadly. A monk might dip a cloth in cold water, wipe his face, and call it piety. The result was an odd paradox. Water was sacred, but also feared.
The poor man's purification. For peasants, hygiene was never about health. It was about survival. Their homes were simple: one room, one hearth, dirt floors. Animals slept inside during winter to share body heat. The smell of smoke, manure, sweat, and straw blended into one permanent scent, a scent they could no longer even notice. Once or twice a year, the village might gather by the river for a communal wash. It was as much festival as hygiene. They'd strip to their linen, splash water over their faces, laugh and curse at the cold. But even then, superstition lingered. A sudden chill could let death in. Many believed that bathing in cold water weakened the soul. To keep clean between these rare washes, people relied on other tricks. They combed their hair with bone combs to remove lice. They rubbed themselves with coarse linen to scrape away dirt. They burned herbs, sage, rosemary, thyme, to mask body odor and purify the air. And if they were lucky enough to live near a monastery or a manor, they might collect the gray water used by nobles, the leftovers from someone else's bath. That second-hand water was still better than the river. The noble's bath. Nobility had a different relationship with water. They could afford to make it beautiful. In castles, servants filled wooden tubs lined with cloth, scented with rose petals, bay leaves, and vinegar. A lady might soak for hours while her maids poured warm water from jugs. A lord returning from battle would bathe with oils believed to seal the pores against illness. Bathing for nobles became a luxury, a ritual of power. The more perfumed your bath, the higher your station. But it was also a performance, something done in private yet spoken of in public to show refinement. The irony was, the water they used was often drawn from the same contaminated wells as everyone else's. The only difference was the scent.
In the French court of the 14th century, King John II's doctors recommended he avoid bathing altogether. They feared it would make him vulnerable to the plague wind. Instead, they prescribed daily wiping with a clean linen cloth soaked in wine. That idea spread quickly through Europe's elite. If wine could cleanse the soul, surely it could cleanse the body. And so the rich stopped bathing and started polishing. The collapse of clean water. By the 1300s, Europe's cities were choking on their own waste. London's population had passed 80,000. Paris had over 200,000. The rivers that once sparkled now bubbled with rot. The great cathedrals rose skyward, symbols of divine perfection, but beneath them ran a hell of filth. People threw everything into the street: ashes, bones, dung, blood, fish guts, rotting straw. When it rained, the streets turned to liquid mud. When it dried, the dust carried disease. In 1348, the Black Death struck, and suddenly fear of water became fear of death itself. Some doctors prescribed frequent bathing to draw out the pestilence. Others warned that bathing made you more likely to catch it. The people were divided. One half washed in panic, the other stopped washing altogether. Either way, no one was safe. It was only later, in the Renaissance, that cities began to rebuild water systems, not out of love for cleanliness, but for control. The ruling elite realized that clean streets and controlled waste meant fewer uprisings, fewer plagues, and more power. And so, from filth came governance. The legacy of fear. The fear of water lingered for centuries. Even in the 1600s, doctors warned against full bathing. They believed that illness entered through the skin. When King Louis XIV of France reigned in the 17th century, he famously bathed only twice in his entire life, but changed clothes several times a day. Linen, not soap, was still the measure of hygiene. The royal physicians encouraged him to stay dry. Moisture, they said, unbalanced the humors. Better to perfume the body than to cleanse it. It was not until the Enlightenment, the late 1700s, that Europe finally rediscovered the truth the Romans had known all along: that water, properly used, was health, not harm. By then, centuries of superstition had left their mark. The medieval fear of water had shaped not just hygiene, but psychology. To medieval people, purity was spiritual, not physical. The dirt on the skin meant nothing compared to the stain on the soul. They lived, loved, and died in filth, but believed themselves clean in the eyes of God.
A world reborn. When we think of medieval life, we picture castles, knights, and kings. But beneath the armor and banners, the real story is one of smell, sickness, and survival. The fear of water tells us everything about the age: how fragile knowledge was, how power and superstition ruled over reason. It was a time when ignorance was armor, and fear itself became tradition. And yet, from that darkness, the modern world slowly emerged. Public baths returned. Wells were deepened and sealed. Cities learned to channel water instead of fearing it. The water that once killed became the water that saved. And perhaps, deep down, that's the greatest irony of all, that civilization was born not from cleanliness, but from the centuries-long battle against the very thing that makes us clean. The secret life of medieval teeth. When you think of medieval Europe, you might imagine dirty streets, foul rivers, and smoky halls, but few realize that the real horror of hygiene often started right inside the mouth. To modernize, medieval teeth are the symbol of decay, blackened, broken, crooked. Yet the truth is more complex, stranger, and in some ways more human than we imagine.
For while the streets of London stank and the baths of Paris gathered dust, another war was being fought quietly in every mouth across Europe. The war against rot, against pain, against a world that had no toothbrushes and no mercy. The smile of the Middle Ages. If you were to meet a peasant woman from the 13th century, her smile might surprise you. Her teeth, though crooked, wouldn't necessarily be black. In fact, many medieval peasants had better teeth than nobles. Why? Because sugar, that sweet killer of enamel, was a luxury reserved for the elite. The poor lived on coarse bread, vegetables, and porridge. Meat was rare, fruit seasonal. Their diet wore down teeth, but didn't rot them. The wealthy, on the other hand, indulged in candied almonds, sweet wines, and dried fruits soaked in honey, pleasures imported from the East during the Crusades. By the 14th century, sugar had become a status symbol. A nobleman's blackened teeth were perversely a sign of wealth. The darker the enamel, the richer the life. But there was another problem, far more painful than vanity: infection. The dentist of the Dark Ages. Dentistry as we know it didn't exist. Toothache was common, constant, and agonizing. Without anesthetic, without antiseptic, pain became a fact of life. When rot set in, there were only 3 people you could turn to: the barber, the monk, or the local blacksmith. Each of them used the same instrument, iron tongs heated over a flame. Barbers, who already wielded razors and scissors, were often called upon to draw teeth. A red and white pole outside the shop didn't just mean haircuts. It was a symbol of blood and bandages. Imagine it. You sit on a stool, gripping the arms as the barber pours ale into your mouth for courage. He grips your molar with iron tongs and pulls, twisting, yanking, praying it comes out in one piece. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. The screams echoed down the streets, mingling with church bells and market chatter. And if the patient lived, he thanked God for the mercy of pain ending. The monastic tooth. Monks were the scholars and doctors of the medieval world. In monasteries, they studied anatomy from ancient Roman and Arabic texts. They made herbal poultices, mixtures of sage, cloves, and vinegar, to numb pain or clean wounds. Some monasteries even had specialized infirmaries where the sick and dying were treated. There, monks learned to recognize dental decay. They prescribed chewing mint or fennel seeds for breath, rinsing the mouth with vinegar or wine, and rubbing ashes mixed with salt on the gums to harden the teeth. It was crude, but it worked. A little. When infection spread, though, there was nothing they could do. The rot would creep into the jawbone, the face would swell, and the patient might die from sepsis long before anyone understood the cause. Still, monks wrote their remedies carefully into parchment books. They believed that every herb had a soul, every illness a sin, and toothache to them was punishment for gluttony, a divine reminder not to indulge too deeply in worldly pleasures. The blacksmith's solution. But not everyone had access to monks. In villages and crossroads, it was often the blacksmith who played dentist. Why the blacksmith? Because he had the tools, the strength, and no fear of blood. A customer would come with a swollen jaw, moaning in pain. The blacksmith would heat a pair of tongs, pour ale over them for purity, and get to work. A scream, a twist, a gush of blood, and the tooth was gone. Sometimes the jaw broke with it. When infection followed, villagers turned to superstition. They buried the pulled tooth under a tree to trap the pain. In Germany, mothers told children to throw baby teeth over their shoulder and call to the sun, saying, "Son, son, take my tooth of bone. Give me a tooth of gold." It was a prayer, half hope, half fear.
The secret life of medieval teeth. When you think of medieval Europe, you might imagine dirty streets, foul rivers, and smoky halls. But few realize that the real horror of hygiene often started right inside the mouth. To modernize, medieval teeth are the symbol of decay, blackened, broken, crooked. Yet the truth is more complex, stranger, and in some ways more human than we imagine. For while the streets of London stank and the baths of Paris gathered dust, another war was being fought quietly in every mouth across Europe. The war against rot, against pain, against a world that had no toothbrushes and no mercy. The smile of the Middle Ages. If you were to meet a peasant woman from the 13th century, her smile might surprise you. Her teeth, though crooked, wouldn't necessarily be black. In fact, many medieval peasants had better teeth than nobles. Why? Because sugar, that sweet killer of enamel, was a luxury reserved for the elite. The poor lived on coarse bread, vegetables, and porridge. Meat was rare, fruit seasonal. Their diet wore down teeth, but didn't rot them. The wealthy, on the other hand, indulged in candied almonds, sweet wines, and dried fruits soaked in honey, pleasures imported from the East during the Crusades. By the 14th century, sugar had become a status symbol. A nobleman's blackened teeth were perversely a sign of wealth. The darker the enamel, the richer the life. But there was another problem, far more painful than vanity: infection. The dentist of the Dark Ages. Dentistry as we know it didn't exist. Toothache was common, constant, and agonizing. Without anesthetic, without antiseptic, pain became a fact of life. When rot set in, there were only three people you could turn to: the barber, the monk, or the local blacksmith. Each of them used the same instrument, iron pliers heated over a flame. Barbers, who already wielded razors and scissors, were often called upon to draw teeth. A red and white pole outside the shop didn't just mean haircuts. It was a symbol of blood and bandages. Imagine it. You sit on a stool, gripping the arms as the barber pours ale into your mouth for courage. He grips your molar with iron tongs and pulls, twisting, yanking, praying it comes out in one piece. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. The screams echoed down the streets, mingling with church bells and market chatter. And if the patient lived, he thanked God for the mercy of pain ending. The monastic tooth. Monks were the scholars and doctors of the medieval world. In monasteries, they studied anatomy from ancient Roman and Arabic texts. They made herbal poultices, mixtures of sage, cloves, and vinegar to numb pain or clean wounds. Some monasteries even had specialized infirmaries where the sick and dying were treated. There, monks learned to recognize dental decay. They prescribed chewing mint or fennel seeds for breath, rinsing the mouth with vinegar or wine, and rubbing ashes mixed with salt on the gums to harden the teeth. It was crude, but it worked. A little. When infection spread, though, there was nothing they could do. The rot would creep into the jawbone, the face would swell, and the patient might die from sepsis long before anyone understood the cause. Still, monks wrote their remedies carefully into parchment books. They believed that every herb had a soul, every illness a sin, and toothache to them was punishment for gluttony, a divine reminder not to indulge too deeply in worldly pleasures. The blacksmith's solution. But not everyone had access to monks. In villages and crossroads, it was often the blacksmith who played dentist. Why the blacksmith? Because he had the tools, the strength, and no fear of blood.
A customer would come with a swollen jaw, moaning in pain. The blacksmith would heat a pair of tongs, pour ale over them for purity, and get to work. A scream, a twist, a gush of blood, and the tooth was gone. Sometimes the jaw broke with it. When infection followed, villagers turned to superstition. They buried the tooth under a tree to trap the pain. In Germany, mothers told children to throw baby teeth over their shoulder and call to the sun, saying, "Son, son, take my tooth of bone. Give me a tooth of gold." It was a prayer, half hope, half fear.
The stench of salvation, medieval bathing, and the war on dirt. The Middle Ages have long been branded the dirty years, centuries when soap was rare, water was feared, and perfume replaced cleanliness. But the truth, as always, is stranger. Medieval Europe was not a world without baths. It was a world obsessed with them, then terrified by them, then forbidden from taking them. This is the story of how Europe went from steam and song to stench and sin, and why for hundreds of years a simple bath became an act of rebellion against God, disease, and death. The bathhouse before the fall. In the early medieval centuries, Europe still remembered Rome, and Rome had loved its baths. Vast marble halls filled with hot water, mosaics, and gossip. The first kings of the early Middle Ages tried to imitate that luxury. By the 9th century, Charlemagne himself had built magnificent bathing halls at Aachen, complete with tiled floors and running water drawn from hot springs. He bathed every Saturday, often inviting courtiers to join him. Cities like Paris, London, and Regensburg soon followed the imperial example. Public bathhouses became social hubs, places where merchants, travelers, and even monks met to wash, eat, and relax. Some were simple wooden huts beside rivers. Others were grand, candlelit halls where bathers sat in heated tubs surrounded by steam and laughter. Men and women often bathed together, scandalous by later standards. They drank wine, shared gossip, sometimes even sang hymns while scrubbing away the dirt of the world. To bathe was to live, to cleanse both body and soul. The scent of sin. But purity is never far from temptation. The church watched these bathhouses with suspicion. Priests warned that mixed bathing led to lust and that warmth, water, and nakedness were gateways for the devil. By the 12th century, many bathhouses had indeed become places of more than washing. In Paris, estues, or public steam baths, were often attached to brothels. Customers could rent a room, a tub, and sometimes a companion. Moralists began to preach that the steam itself corrupted the flesh. Monks wrote treatises claiming that heat stirs the humors of sin. Soon, confessionals filled with guilty voices. "Forgive me, Father, for I have bathed too long." The irony, the same church that condemned sensual baths encouraged spiritual ones. Holy water cleansed the soul. River baptisms saved it. But warm water, that was indulgence. And indulgence in the medieval world led to damnation.
Soap and the smell of sanctity. Medieval soap existed, but it wasn't pleasant. Made from animal fat mixed with ash or lye, it was rough, greasy, and reeked faintly of death. In Northern Europe, people rubbed themselves with lye soap made from pig fat and birch ash. In southern lands, like Spain and Italy,
The art of soap making reached a higher level thanks to Arabic influence, using olive oil instead of animal grease. The best came from Aleppo, where traders bought fragrant olive and laurel bars wrapped in silk. These soaps made their way across the Mediterranean and into noble courts, where they were treasured luxuries, used not daily, but ceremonially. A peasant might wash once a week or once a month, depending on the season. In winter, water was too cold. In summer, rivers were foul with waste. Instead of bathing, people used dry cleaning methods, wiping the body with rough linen, dusting with herbs like lavender or rosemary, or changing underclothes to draw out dirt. It didn't work, but it made them feel clean, and that mattered. The Great Turning, when clean became dangerous. In the 14th century, everything changed. The Black Death arrived, and with it a new fear of water. Physicians of the time believed disease spread through miasma, or poisonous air. Warm water, they argued, opened the pores and let death creep inside. Public baths, once crowded with laughter, became silent. Steam turned to stigma. Cities across Europe closed their bathhouses, claiming they were nests of pestilence. In England, Parliament even ordered that the bathing tubs be broken and cast away. Doctors advised wiping the body with vinegar-soaked cloths instead of washing. People sealed their windows, stuffed herbs into their clothes, and prayed. Cleanliness had become a risk. Dirt became armor. By the 15th century, the medieval bathhouse had vanished from most towns, replaced by perfume bottles, powders, and superstition. Perfume and the mask of cleanliness. When bathing vanished, scent took its place. The nobles of late medieval Europe learned to hide filth with fragrance. They wore pomanders, tiny silver balls filled with cloves, amber, and musk, hung from belts or rosaries. Women stuffed lavender into their bodices and sleeves. Men dabbed rosewater on their beards. Perfume became a mark of civilization and a weapon against decay. People believed good smells drove away disease. Doctors prescribed walking through gardens or burning herbs indoors to purify the air. In France, Queen Isabella of Bavaria was said to bathe only twice a year, but she changed her linen daily and drowned herself in violet scent. In England, courtiers sprinkled their wigs and beards with orange blossom water. The body might be dirty, but the soul could still smell clean. The peasants' wash. For peasants, bathing was simpler, harsher, and more practical. A wooden tub in front of the hearth served for the entire family, father first, then mother, then children, all sharing the same water. Soap was rare, so they used ashes, sand, or even fermented urine as cleaning agents. They washed when they could, but never for pleasure, only for necessity. Washing the feet was a daily ritual after field work. Hands and face were cleaned before meals and prayers. Full body baths were reserved for holy days or weddings. Rivers and lakes were the poor man's bathhouse. In summer, entire villages might gather to wash clothes and bodies together, laughing, gossiping, and occasionally singing church hymns to make the act respectable. But as plague and church warnings spread, even these small rituals began to fade. Cleanliness was no longer virtue, it was vanity.
The return of the bath. And yet, somewhere in the darkness of late medieval Europe, water still flowed. In Hungary, thermal springs continued to attract nobles seeking healing waters. In Italy, physicians in Padua and Florence began rediscovering Roman texts on hygiene. They argued that bathing could restore health, balance humors, and strengthen the body against disease. By the early Renaissance, the bath was being reborn, cautiously. Doctors prescribed warm baths for fevers. herbal steams for skin diseases, and mineral soaks for gout. Private bath chambers appeared in castles once again, but this time they were for the few, not for the many. In England, Henry IV had a personal bath made of wood lined with linen. In Florence, the Medici built tiled rooms with heated floors and perfumed basins. Bathing was no longer communal. It was elite, intimate, and hidden from the eyes of priests. The poor remained as they were, unwashed, unperfumed, untouched by luxury. Cleansing the soul, not the skin. Despite the slow return of bathing, spiritual purification remained far more important. Pilgrims washed their feet before shrines. Priests sprinkled holy water at Mass. The faithful believed that sin, not sweat, was the true filth to be removed. One chronicler wrote in 1483, "Better a dirty body and a clean conscience than a perfumed sinner before the Lord." The message was clear. Clean hands could not save a dirty soul. And so, while the Renaissance dawned, with its art, its beauty, its rediscovery of the human form, most of Europe still stank. Behind the silks and frescoes, the perfumes and prayers, was the reek of a world learning to be human again. Epilogue: the steam that never died. Even in its decline, the bath never vanished entirely. In small villages across Germany and Scandinavia, the ancient sauna survived. Peasants continued to heat stones, pour water, and sweat out the week's dirt. To them, it wasn't sin, it was survival. And perhaps that's where the truest spirit of medieval hygiene lived on, not in the palaces or sermons, but in a smoky hut on a frozen night, where steam rose like incense, and the body, for a brief moment, remembered what it felt like to be clean. Because even in the darkest ages, the desire for cleanliness, for renewal, never truly died. It only went underground, waiting for the world to believe in water again.
Behind the castle walls, the hidden hygiene of royalty. When people imagine medieval castles, they see grand halls, shining armor, and noble banquets. But the truth, as always, lies in the corners the torches never reached, in the smells, stains, and sounds behind the stone. Beneath the velvet and gold, every royal court was a delicate balance between splendor and stench. Because no matter how rich or powerful you were, in the Middle Ages, filth had no favorites. A fortress of filth. From the outside, castles looked majestic, towers piercing the sky, banners snapping in the wind. But inside, reality was rough. The air reeked of smoke, sweat, dogs, damp stone, and people. There were no chimneys in early castles. Fires burned in open hearths, filling the great hall with choking fumes. Windows, if they existed at all, were small and unglazed, just slits covered with oiled linen to block the wind. Walls were rarely cleaned, soot collected in corners, rats nested in rushes strewn across the floor. Those rushes, the medieval version of carpet, were made from reeds and herbs, meant to absorb dirt and odor. But over weeks, they became compost, food scraps, dog bones, wine spills, and insects, all mixing into a living rug. One 14th century visitor described the Royal Hall of Westminster as rich in gold and filth alike. Luxury above, rot below. The royal privy,
a throne of a different kind. Every castle had its secrets and its smells. The most important of them all was the garde-robe, the medieval toilet, a small stone room usually built into a castle wall with a wooden seat and a long shaft that dropped directly into the moat or a cesspit below. Some castles had dozens of garde-robes, others had only a few. In winter, the wind howled through them like ghosts. In summer, the stench was strong enough to make courtiers faint. Servants were responsible for cleaning these pits, a task so unpleasant that it became its own profession. They were called gong farmers in England, gong meaning filth. These men worked at night, digging through human waste to empty the pits, often waist deep in sludge. Despite the horror, garde-robes had one strange advantage. The ammonia from urine helped kill fleas and lice in clothes hung nearby. So nobles often stored their finest garments in toilet chambers, a bizarre, practical ritual of cleanliness by proximity to filth. Washing like a king. Royal washing was ceremonial. Each morning, servants brought a basin of water and a linen cloth to the monarch's bedside. The king would dip his fingers, rinse his mouth with wine or mint water, and wipe his face, not to remove dirt, but to prepare for the day's prayers. Full baths were rare, but grand occasions. A tub was set up in the royal chamber, lined with linen and filled with water heated over the kitchen fires. Perfumed herbs like rosemary, lavender, and thyme floated on the surface. Musicians might play nearby while the monarch soaked. For Queen Isabella of France, attendants sprinkled rose petals in her bath and poured warm milk over her skin. For Henry III of England, the water was scented with orange peel and cloves. But such luxury came at a price. Dozens of servants had to carry and heat the water, then empty the tub afterward. So even kings didn't bathe often, maybe once a month, sometimes less. Linen, the hidden secret of cleanliness. The medieval elite had one weapon against filth: linen. Changing linen was a form of cleanliness. A nobleman might wear 2 or 3 fresh undershirts in a single day. The soft fabric absorbed sweat and oil, and by changing it frequently, one could wash without water. Rich households owned massive laundries where servants boiled clothes in lye and pounded them clean with wooden paddles. The scent of soap and smoke drifted through castle courtyards, a rare whiff of cleanliness amid decay. For nobles, a crisp white shirt was more than comfort. It was class. A spotless linen tunic meant refinement, discipline, and wealth. After all, only the rich could afford to keep clean in a world where everything was dirty. The perfumed court. Royal courts smelled, but they also pretended not to. Perfume, herbs, and incense were the weapons of denial. Chambers were fumigated with juniper, rosemary, or ambergris. Royal gloves were soaked in rose water. Queens wore pomanders of musk around their necks. King Louis IV of France was said to perfume his clothes daily and keep flowers by his bedside year-round. Henry VIII burned cedar wood in his rooms and doused himself in cologne before court appearances. Perfume became political. Smelling good meant appearing divine, chosen by God, untouched by the filth of common life. The irony was painful. Outside the palace, peasants lived knee-deep in mud. Inside, kings fought stench with roses.
The Queen's Chamber of Secrets.
While kings worried about armor and ceremony, queens faced a different struggle: personal hygiene in confinement. Women of the royal household spent much of their time indoors, layered in heavy gowns and corsets. Bathing was a challenge, privacy scarce, water cold, superstition strong. So queens relied on linen cloths, perfumed oils, and herbal tonics. Medieval beauty manuals advised washing the face with morning dew collected from rose petals. To whiten the skin, a sign of nobility, women used lead-based powder, which poisoned them slowly. To redden lips, they used crushed berries. To clean teeth, ashes mixed with mint. Hair was rarely washed, but often scented. Combs of ivory or bone were dipped in lavender oil to draw out the lice. In royal chambers, maids boiled rosemary to make aromatic rinses. A clean scent meant grace, and grace meant power.
The dirty truth of medieval medicine when doctors tried to clean the soul. In the dark corners of a medieval infirmary, the line between medicine and miracle blurred like smoke. A patient lay moaning on a straw mat. The smell of vinegar, sweat, and incense hung in the air. Beside him, a doctor in a long black robe held a jar of leeches and whispered a prayer. To heal the body, he first had to cleanse the soul. The balance of blood and faith. In the Middle Ages, health was not a science, it was a harmony. Doctors believed the body was ruled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Sickness came when these fluids fell out of balance, disturbed by sin, bad air, or even the position of the stars. The cure was simple and terrifying. To restore balance, you had to remove the excess. So medieval physicians bled their patients. They opened a vein in the arm or neck and let the blood flow into a bowl marked with sacred symbols. Sometimes a few ounces, sometimes enough to leave the patient pale and trembling. Monks recorded these procedures with pride. Quote, "In draining the blood, the devil flees the body." End quote. Cleanliness in medicine meant purification by blood, by fire, or by faith. The instruments of healing. The medieval doctor's tools were as elegant as they were brutal. Bronze scalpels, glass cups for suction, silver spoons for mixing potions. But the most feared was the cautery iron, heated red hot to burn out infection or sin. Surgeons, often barbers by trade, cut abscesses, pulled teeth, and stitched wounds with linen threads soaked in wine. Anesthesia did not exist. Prayers replaced painkillers. To cleanse a wound, they poured honey, vinegar, or even urine, believing that purity could be found in the humblest substances. Hospitals were not clean in the modern sense, but they were holy. Beds lined long halls facing a chapel. Each treatment began with confession and ended with a blessing. Because in the medieval mind, disease came from the soul before it touched the skin. Herbs, holy water, and hope. Not all medicine was cruelty. Some of it was astonishingly gentle, drawn from gardens and ancient memory. Monastic infirmaries cultivated herbs that still serve modern medicine. Sage for fever, mint for digestion, lavender for wounds. Holy water was mixed with wine and honey to soothe the throat. Beeswax sealed ointments made from rose oil and animal fat. Every monastery had a physic garden. Green sanctuaries where monks in brown robes whispered prayers over rosemary and rue. To them, tending plants was an act of divine mercy. Healing meant working with God's creation, not against it. And yet, even this kindness had its limits. When the plague came, no herb could save them.
The Plague and the Panic of Purity. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, medicine collapsed into fear. Doctors wore long robes coated in wax, gloves, and beaked masks stuffed with herbs to filter the air. They looked like creatures from nightmares, half priest, half crow. They believed the disease came through miasma, poisoned air, or through sin. So to cleanse the world, people burned incense, bathed in vinegar, or whipped themselves in the streets as penance. Bathhouses were shut down. Doctors advised against bathing altogether, warning that water opens the skin to corruption. Soap became sinful, perfume divine. In the desperation for purity, Europe drowned in dirt. The healers of shadows. And yet, amid the terror, some healers defied superstition. Women, midwives, and herbalists, often called wise women or witches, treated the sick with practical compassion. They boiled water when others feared it, used garlic and onion for infection, and encouraged washing. But the church mistrusted them. Clean hands and calm reason looked too much like rebellion. Many were accused of sorcery. Their knowledge burned with them. In time, their wisdom about cleanliness, herbs, and hygiene would be rediscovered and renamed science. But in their own age, they were ghosts in the margins of history, silent, kind, and condemned. The birth of modern cleanliness. By the 15th century, a quiet shift began. Doctors studying in Italy and France started questioning the old humors. They read ancient Greek and Arabic texts that hinted at something radical, that disease might come from the environment, not divine punishment. Water returned to medicine. Surgeons began washing tools in wine or vinegar before operations. Hospitals added windows for fresh air. It wasn't yet the germ theory, but it was the beginning of thought, the start of science emerging from faith's shadow. And though the medieval healer may seem ignorant now, he was fighting chaos with the only tools he had: prayer, patience, and courage. In his fumbling search for purity, he paved the way for every doctor who came after him.
The forbidden remedies, when magic and medicine collided. In the late Middle Ages, when sickness stalked every street and prayers often failed, people began to look elsewhere for healing, into the shadows. Behind church walls and beyond city gates, whispered words and glowing potions offered hope that science could not. To the desperate, it was medicine. To the church, it was heresy. But to history, it was something stranger still: the birth of chemistry, pharmacy, and the endless human hunger to survive. Between faith and forbidden fire. It began with the alchemists, those strange men who mixed gold, mercury, and mystery in pursuit of eternal life. They called themselves philosophers of nature. In candle-lit chambers, they crushed herbs, distilled vapors, and watched metals melt into color. To the church, they seemed dangerously close to sorcerers, for they spoke of transformation, of turning the impure into the pure. But alchemy wasn't just about gold. It was about the soul. To heal metal was to heal man. To purify a substance was to cleanse the world of sin. And from those smoky experiments came something extraordinary, the first true medicines. A 13th century monk named Roger Bacon distilled spirits from wine to make antiseptic alcohol. Arab scholars brought new ingredients from the East: camphor, opium, myrrh. And though they were condemned as unholy, these healers quietly saved lives that prayer alone could not. The witch's cabinet. Not all magic wore robes and spoke Latin. In the countryside, women, Midwives, herbalists, and mothers tended their secret gardens. They gathered foxglove for the heart, willow bark for fever, poppy for pain. They boiled leaves under the moon, whispering charms as they stirred. To them, there was no difference between a blessing and a spell. A prayer to Saint Mary might become a chant to the old gods without anyone noticing. What mattered was whether the child lived, whether the wound closed, whether the fever broke. But power frightened men. When these healers healed too well, they were accused of witchcraft. The Church could not accept that grace might flow through unholy hands. Records from the 14th century France tell of healers burned for using herbs without prayer. One was said to have cured a nobleman's blindness with green fire, likely a copper-based salve. Another called down rain by boiling rosemary, thyme, and ashes, a ritual older than Christianity itself. They weren't witches. They were scientists in a world that didn't yet have science. The monk and the moonlight. Inside monasteries, the line between miracle and experiment blurred. Monks copied ancient medical texts, Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, sometimes adding strange new recipes of their own. They wrote of moon potions for melancholy, angel waters for infection, and spirit oils distilled from flowers. To the faithful, these were divine remedies. To modernize, they were antidepressants made from natural essential oils. Knowledge crept forward quietly, hiding behind scripture and ritual. Science survived by speaking the language of faith. But the Church did not forgive easily. In the 15th century, the Inquisition spread across Europe, hunting heretics and poisoners of the soul. Astrologers, midwives, and healers were dragged from their homes, their books burned, their tools smashed. The Church feared not just their power, but their independence. A world that believed in herbs and stars might stop believing in priests. In Germany, a woman named Walpurga Hausmannen was tortured for carrying ointments of the moon. In Italy, a physician was executed for using mercury on plague victims, a treatment that actually worked. Fear turned medicine into magic, and magic into a crime. And yet, even as the flames rose across Europe, knowledge survived, smuggled in secret manuscripts, disguised as prayers, whispered from teacher to student. Every potion burned gave birth to 10 more. When the stars became science. By the late Middle Ages, even universities began to change. In Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, scholars dared to study medicine as a craft, not a calling. They mapped the body like a kingdom, charted fevers like weather, and even measured the movement of planets to time their cures. Astrology, once heresy, became a medical tool. Doctors drew horoscopes to decide when to bleed a patient or deliver a child. The stars guided surgery, not superstition. And behind those stars, another revolution stirred. Observation, experiment, and doubt. The first glimmer of the scientific age. But the cost of curiosity. Many who sought forbidden knowledge paid with their lives. Healers exiled, books burned, bodies dissected in secret by candlelight. The 15th century was a paradox, an age of enlightenment wrapped in darkness. People were still dying of plague and pox, but they were dying under a sky that finally seemed to make sense. The old gods were fading, the saints were silent, and in their place stood the fragile, dangerous idea that truth could be found not in heaven, but in the hands of man. Epilogue. The whisper that became science. Every age has its forbidden knowledge. For the Middle Ages, it was the belief that man could heal himself. The herbalist, the alchemist, the monk, and the witch, all were pieces of the same story, the human refusal to accept suffering as fate. Their mixtures of fire and faith prayer and poison, paved the way for everything that came next: chemistry, pharmacy, medicine itself. They burned for their curiosity, but from their ashes rose understanding. And if you listen closely, in the silence of an old apothecary or the echo of a monastery wall, you can still hear their whispered prayer, not to saints or stars, but to truth itself. Heal what can be healed, forgive what cannot, and never stop asking why.
In medieval Europe, the air itself told a story. Streets stank of rot, sweat, smoke, and sewage. People lived side by side with animals, and water, when not brown or full of parasites, was considered dangerous. Bathing was rare, especially after the church began to view it as a temptation to sin. Yet despite the filth, medieval people cared deeply about how they smelled. The upper classes found a solution not in cleanliness, but in camouflage, through perfume, oils, and scented clothing that turned stench into a sign of wealth. By the 13th century, scent had become a quiet language of class. The poor smelled of sweat and smoke. The rich smelled of roses and ambergris. Perfume was not about hygiene, it was about power. A noblewoman might dab her neck and sleeves with musk or lavender before attending court. Knights wore gloves soaked in perfumed oils before battle to mask the smell of men and blood. Even letters were sometimes sealed with scented wax, as if to carry a noble's presence through the air. But beneath those luxurious layers, no one was truly clean. Soap was expensive and scarce, and bathing, though common in earlier centuries, declined sharply by the late Middle Ages. The church warned that the naked body invites the devil. Public bathhouses, once symbols of Roman civility, became associated with lust and sin. So people stopped washing and started masking. The science and fantasy of scent. Perfume making was both an art and a superstition. The best scents came from Islamic Spain and Renaissance Italy, where apothecaries distilled rosewater, jasmine, and cloves imported from the East. These exotic ingredients were ground, boiled, and mixed with animal fats or oils, then stored in glass or ivory containers. Common ingredients included ambergris, a rare wax from whale intestines used to make scents last; civet, an oily substance from a cat-like animal's glands, prized for musk tones; roses, violets, rosemary, and sage, the affordable, local fragrances of Europe. But perfumes were more than fashion. People believed scent had medical power. A pleasant smell was thought to purify the air and protect the soul. Physicians advised nobles to inhale sweet herbs to guard against plague, since foul odors were blamed for spreading disease. When the Black Death struck, kings carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with spices, to filter the corruption of the air. Perfume wasn't just vanity, it was survival. The scented war between sin and sanctity. The church had a complicated relationship with perfume. On one hand, incense and holy oils were part of sacred ritual. On the other, the use of perfume for pleasure or seduction was condemned as prideful and immoral. Sermons warned that a woman who smells too sweet has already sinned in her heart. Yet bishops and abbots themselves often wore perfumed gloves and robes, claiming the scent symbolized divine purity. It was a hypocrisy everyone smelled, but no one dared to name. In convents, nuns sometimes made simple herbal waters, rose and violet, to keep away lice and infection. But in the courts of France or Italy, fragrance became theater. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France in the 16th century, was infamous for her perfumers who crafted scented gloves, rumored to contain both charm and poison. A whiff of power, quite literally. The hidden stench beneath. Despite the floral masks, real medieval life was a sensory assault. Chamber pots were dumped into streets. Butchers threw animal remains into gutters. Soap, made from animal fat and lye, was harsh and unpleasant. Clothes were rarely washed, only aired out with perfumed smoke or herbs. A noble's gown might smell of musk and rot at once. Silk scented with decay.
Peasants, meanwhile, used whatever they could find: thyme, mint, or vinegar. They rubbed herbs into their clothes or hair, believing strong smells warded off evil and disease. In truth, however, the perfume only hid what centuries of poverty could not erase. The birth of modern fragrance. Still, something remarkable happened. Through the